So thanks again. Super happy to be here. Thanks, Jenna, for reaching out and inviting me to come. Super fun. Also, thanks again to all the people that stuck their necks out and did the workshop this morning. I had fun. I'm going to just totally put on my science hat now and talk about a line of work I've been doing, probably for maybe 10 years or so. It's kind of culminating, so you guys are sort of getting it at a right time. What I'm going to do, hopefully, is kind of talk about sort of the big picture consequences of this line of work. So even if you don't care about little tiny fish, I'm hoping that you'll sort of grasp sort of the higher level lessons I've gained by trying to think about how do we manage human activities that affect ecosystems and food webs in potentially profound ways. So to begin with, I'm going to be talking about little tiny fish. So by little fish, I mean the different words that we use for them in the aquatic realm are forage fish, bait fish, little shiny fish, bait fish. I already said bait fish. Small pelagic fish is an example. Those are nice words, but better words would be like herrings. Anchovies, sardines, those probably conjure up images in your mind of schooling, abundant, usually pretty productive fish that you find in coastal waters all over the place. And honestly, I'm going to be talking about them, but I think this is really more of my muse. And what I mean by that is by thinking about forage fish, it's really led me to ask a lot of questions about what does it mean to try to manage human activities with a broader eye towards the ecosystem, and does it really mean that we need to understand every intricacy of a system, or are there sort of simpler ways to try to achieve the same ecological benefits while we're still getting the economic benefits from resource extraction? So that's kind of the big picture theme. So why is forage fish such an interesting muse? Well, as I mentioned, they are abundant and they're productive, and they are really important sources of food for a wide number of predators that generally humans care about. So a lot of whales, humpback whales, famously do their bubble netting. If you don't know what that is, just YouTube it later on tonight, and then be prepared to spend the next 45 minutes looking at YouTube videos of it. It's super cool. A lot of seabirds, of course, are very dependent on and those are things that people value. So they provide a service by feeding things that we care a lot about, even if you don't care about these small silvery fish. At the same time, they also are important prey for a lot of fish species that we like to catch to eat. So they're playing another really important role in terms of feeding these things so that we can then go and catch them like this big plump Atlantic cod right here. So they seem to be playing this important ecosystem role, connecting sort of the bottom of the food web to things that people really care about. At the same time, there are enormous fisheries around the world that also are targeting these things as well. So while on one hand we value these species to feed seals, to feed whales, dolphins, all those things, we also value them to feed things that we want to catch like tunas and cod and whatnot. We also value them because we want to catch them. And in fact, most of the largest fisheries around the world are going after these small pelagic fishes. And the biggest one by far is the Peruvian anchoveta fishery, which is in a good year, is easily the biggest volume of fishery in the entire world. But of the top 10 global fisheries, like 3 or 4 of them are all going to be these small silvery fish. So really important, and of course that feeds into economies, feeds into livelihoods, et cetera, et cetera. So these fishes are giving a lot of benefits to humans. So the challenge then, then you might be saying, hey, but I don't eat a lot of fish. I don't eat a lot of anchovies, sardines, so I'm not eating them. Well, it turns out the vast majority of these things that are caught aren't being sold to people so they can then fry them up and eat them, but rather they're being turned into fish meal. So a lot of it goes into feeding pigs, feeding chickens. A lot of it's going into aquaculture. So I always like to say if you had bacon and eggs for breakfast this morning, you probably had some forage fish this morning, because chances are forage fish was used to feed the things that you ate. Or if you had a farm-raised salmon, again, you were probably eating these things. So we're getting them indirectly. So the real challenge then, and I'm walking back and forth here because the little advancer isn't working, is how do we then strike the balance between all these different things, these values that we get out of forage fish? So on one hand, we want to have fisheries that are able to supply food for all these different things, and it's a real value in terms of enhancing the productivity of livestock. We can raise them more efficiently, and that's a good thing. At the same time, we want enough in the ocean so we have happy whales and do all those different things. How do we strike that balance? And that sort of tension and that trade-off is kind of the source of the muse, what I've been able to explore. How can we think about how do we make decisions about managing fishing that helps protect these other things? Everything okay, Jeremy? Oh, get me a clicker. Oh, thank you. In the meantime, I'm just going to walk back and forth. So, whoa, that's great. All right, thanks, Jeremy. So one view about the role of forage fish and food webs comes from this little infographic. This was, I think, trying to characterize or sort of describe kind of what the California current marine ecosystem looks like. And the basic view, and you'll see a lot of these things if you do a quick search online. The basic idea is there's a lot of small, crunchy stuff at the bottom of the food web, really, really important. There are these big, charismatic things at the top. And then we view forage fish as being particularly important as essentially being this gateway or conduit. And so the idea that one of the things we're worried about fishing sort of happening without any sort of eye to their ecological role is we might be sort of cutting off this really important circuit and essentially starving the top of the food web. This is a really pretty cartoon. But it turns out when you look a little closer at food webs, realize that the story is as nice as sort of like probably if I was teaching like 100 level like ecology and society, this would be really, really nice. But you dig a little deeper and food webs don't look and they don't behave this nicely. In fact, one of the things that I end up doing, boy, I'm not being well respected by my slide forwarder. So this is one particular view. This graph over there is commonly called a Herenogram. It shows basically a food web with all the different linkages. That's a Herenogram of the Benguela ecosystem. And the whole idea is like a really, really messy system where it's not true. So anchovy is this little guy in the middle here. And while it's true they're important, there are a lot of different arrows that go up to the top of the food web that actually short circuit this really important conduit. And one of the things I'm not going to talk about today, but I've done a bit of sort of deep dive into food webs sort of around the world, basically asking, do they look more like this, or do they look more like the Herenogram? And it's the Herenogram, hands down, is by far the most common. So when we're sort of thinking about trying to manage the fisheries that are going after forage fish with an eye towards their ecological role, we're immediately faced with this problem. Is their ecological role is not simple. It's complicated. It's not just this is an easy way of viewing the role, but the reality is much more complex. And that brings me to my central thesis of the presentation today, and what I'm basically, the drum I'm going to beat over and over again, is this idea that when we start thinking about sort of adopting more holistic ecosystem approaches to fisheries management or any type of environmental management, whether it's rangeland management, whether it's forest management, you name it, we immediately look, particularly as ecologists, we look at these systems and we're fascinated by the complexity, right? We just love that. It's great. If the world was simple, our jobs would be done and we'd have nothing to do, right? So we love this stuff. But that doesn't mean that the management systems that are being adopted to deal with that have to be complex as well. In fact, I would argue that the art of sort of adopting these ecosystem approaches is having simplicity in our management that is robust to our ecological complexity. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, is digging into some of the complexities about the actual ways that forage fish exists, thinking about the challenges that it poses, and then how can we then, after taking that deep dive into the complexity, then emerge and sort of take a breath and find simple management solutions that can kind of solve and be robust to that ecological complexity. So I'm basically going to do two vignettes that are largely based on two papers, and I'll show the sort of references at the end if people want to get them. And I should say, if you want the PDFs of those, I'm free to email them out and all that fun stuff. So basically two stories that are basically about different aspects of complexity. The first complexity, oh, it worked. I'm so surprised. Is going to be taking sort of my muse for this little bit was cod and herring in Europe. And if anyone's been to Europe and eats fish, cod and herring show up a lot. Culturally, they're really, really significant, particularly in Northern Europe. They're just a really big deal. And you can sort of think about a system of cod and herring and sort of the status quo in most sort of management circles. It's just like pretend like there's no interaction between them at all. But any ecologist goes, wait a minute, I know that cod's favorite food is herring. And I know that cod can be exerting a fair amount of predation regulation on herring. So we can factor in a little bit of complexity and say, hey, there's a predator-prey link. My luck's over. And say, hey, I can now recognize a slightly more complex and probably more truthful representation of this system by saying, okay, there's cod and herring, and cod are bad for herring, and herring are good for cod. Standard predator-prey linkage. So that's cool. But again, because we're ecologists, we scratch the surface, and we dig a little deeper, and we say, yeah, that's cool, but cod do not spontaneously generate at this size. Right? They're not born that big. Instead, they, of course, start life as little teeny tiny eggs. As little teeny tiny eggs, if they survive, they turn into cute little juvenile cod. And then as juvenile cod, if they're lucky, they'll mature into large-sized cod. So why does that matter? Well, it turns out that herring are no dummies. Herring like eating things that are planktonic, and eggs, guess what, are planktonic. And they're more than happy to gobble down on eggs of cod. They're beautiful, lipid-filled little things floating around. And it turns out in some areas, like the Baltic Sea, they think that herring and other small pelagic fish actually eat a fair amount of the cod eggs that are out there. So now this interaction is getting a little bit more complicated. It's not even clear whether or not having more herring in the system is good or bad from a cod perspective. Because on one hand, it's good on this angle, but on the other hand, it's bad news in terms of ensuring good reproductive success. So even more complexity into the system. And then finally, it turns out, depending on how you want to think about how this predation angle works, this whole system can have a tipping point where it can flip from one alternate state to another. And that is going to be illustrated in this little GIF right here. This is the important part right here. It's just showing like the basin of attraction where I'm just slowly increasing the rate of fishing for cod. And everything is great until it's not great and the cod collapses, pretty much because now there's herring everywhere. They're just wreaking havoc on the cod eggs and they can't do anything. And even if you take the cod fishing back down, you can't get back into this other basin of attraction. You're stuck in this other area. And the only way to get out of it is start hammering the herring until finally it flips back. And now you're sort of back to your regular state. So you can get this flipping point where you go from a herring-dominated system to a cod-dominated system. And when you're in that herring-dominated system, the only way to get it out is just hammer the herring. So that's another layer of complexity to think about. So right away, we start thinking about how can then we manage the system, given that there's a tremendous uncertainty about all these. It seems kind of hopeless. At least it does to me. So the one line of work that I pursued with two amazing collaborators, both at UC Davis, Jim Sankiriko and Marissa Basquette. Jim Sankiriko is a fabulous economist, and Marissa Basquette is an amazing theoretical ecologist. And so we just did some thought experiments, and we said, all right, so let's just imagine a scenario where we can sort of think of an omniscient manager. So this is someone who's in charge of all the fisheries in Europe. And if you don't want it to be Europe, just put it wherever you want. And this omniscient manager knows everything perfectly, knows exactly what's going on between cod and herring at all times. And then we could ask, well, if you were an omniscient manager, what are the series of harvest decisions or management decisions that you would make to try to maximize the total amount of revenue that's generated in the system, with putting in some obvious constraints like you can't remove all of a species and make it go extinct. Okay? So we can do that sort of experiment and do it in a bunch of different sort of scenarios that correspond to those different ecological scenarios that I showed you. No. So specifically, we did a whole bunch of different things. First of all, we started the world in a bunch of different initial conditions that comprise of cod either being abundant or scarce, and then herring being abundant or scarce in all different permutations. Because we thought that might really matter, particularly with that tipping point behavior. And then we basically said, for that omniscient manager that knows exactly what's going on, what would they do if the true interaction was that the two species were totally independent of each other? That truly cod don't affect herring and herring don't affect cod. And then we could say, okay, well, let's layer in that predation interaction. So now we're going to have herring being good for cod and cod being bad for herring. And then to that, we're going to layer in the egg predation bit. And then to that, we're going to layer in the egg predation that causes a tipping point. So in each case, we're going to say, hey, does it really matter which ecological scenario is going on? Does it actually affect the decisions? And now I have to confess something. So I am an ecologist, and I'm working with an economist. And I really, really wanted the ecology to matter a lot. So that was my thing I wanted going in. So the first thing I wanted to do is, do you actually get different harvest decisions depending on which ecological scenario? Because if you don't, I'm out of luck at that point. So that's the first question. So let's take a look at what that looks like for one particular scenario. And so this is kind of what would happen for what the omniscient manager would do to cod for one of those initial conditions if the true interaction was wholly independent. And what would happen in this particular scenario is the omniscient manager would sort of wait a couple years, would let the cod grow, then it would start increasing the mortality rate on the amount of fishing, then it would plateau for a while, then it would kind of fish them really hard at the end. So that's what the omniscient manager would do. If at the same time, or we can then layer in what if there's predation, so you get a different pathway. It has similar flavor to it in that you start off low, ramp up, and then stay there for a while, then go. But at least it does matter whether or not there's predation or not. So I'm feeling good. Let's layer in egg predation. Whoa, totally different pathway. You actually start off fishing really, really hard. Then you take a break for a few years, and then you go back fishing. So the ecological scenario is actually dictating a different optimal strategy. And then finally, with the depensation, an even different strategy still. Namely, you want to wait about 15 years until you start fishing the cod. So I'm feeling pretty good. It seems like ecology matters. So it does matter for the decisions. But the next thing I had to do is well, does it really matter if you actually guessed wrong? How much money would you lose by doing that? So we did a whole second round analysis where instead of thinking about the omniscient manager, we said, well, what about if the decision maker was that guy? And that guy, I figured out that picture comes if you do a Google image search of idiot. That's like the first or second hit. So what I want to know if this idiot has no idea what's really going on. And the idiot is just going to randomly pick one of those four interactions as being right. And he may be right and he may be wrong. And he's going to then apply what the idiot thinks is the best management pathway. And then we can say, well, how much money do you lose because you have an idiot in charge instead of that omniscient manager? And that's really getting at the economic value of knowing the ecological interaction. So you're going to see a bunch of slides that look kind of like this. It's a big grid. So what this has on the top is what is that the idiot person, what do they think is going on? So they either think there's no interaction whatsoever, they think there's a normal predator-prey interaction, they think there's egg predation, and then what I'm calling depensation, that's the tipping point. So those are the choices. This is actually what is truly going on. And then the intensity of the coloration is telling you what is the economic loss. And it's the economic loss from the optimal decision. So the totally white color is there's no loss at all versus the bright red, which is a lot of loss. Okay? So what I'm going to do that is look at that particular result for all those four different starting conditions. And that looks something like this. So prey are abundant initially, prey are scarce initially, piscivores are abundant initially, piscivores are scarce initially. And there's a lot of boxes you can look at, but before you even do that, I just want you just blur your eyes a little bit and just notice how much white space there is on this. It's mostly not colored. And not colored basically means not a whole lot of economic loss. And then even the red bits that show up here and here, that corresponds to a 15% economic loss. And that's not great, but if you sort of think about it, imagine if you were taking a test and you're saying, hey, you could just randomly guess and get an 85%. Who's going to study for that, right? You'd be totally happy with that B. So the little ecologist inside of me died a little bit because it now just seemed to say, well, maybe it doesn't really matter. You could just randomly pick one of these, and you might lose a little bit, but the amount that you lose is kind of small. Now, I'm tenacious, so I'm not going to stop there. And I do the next thing is I dig deeper. I want to convince myself that what I do is important. So the first thing I did is I recognized that this is sort of like the aggregate economic value of the two different fishery sectors. So there's one whole collection of boats that's going after cod, another whole collection of boat that's going after herring, and I'm just pooling all that money together and seeing how much money is lost. So one thing I can do is like, well, why don't I look within those sectors and look at what is the range of either benefits or loss that come from getting these things wrong. And it looks something like this. So for the herring fishery, across the range of all those different combinations of starting conditions, true interaction, and false or assumed interaction and true interaction, for herring, you can actually get a 15% bump, pretty much because you annihilate all the cod and then the herring are really happy, all the way to about 20% loss. So that's not great, but you can probably live with that. For the cod sector, you get about 18% increase, and then a loss that goes so far, it doesn't actually fit on this slide, so I got to keep going. It doesn't fit on that slide, and doesn't fit on that slide, and to get finally down here, and all the way to a 300% loss of economic income for the cod sector. So people care about that, right? Because the aggregate might look nice, but if you tell a bunch of people, hey, good news, you're going to lose 300% of your revenue, but it's fine because these other people over there are going to be making your money. They're not going to be super happy about that. So how then do we then think about a simple management process that sort of is faithful to the ecological complexity? Well, the first step is stop thinking like an optimizer and thinking more like a financial planner or a finance analysis. And if you take Finance 101, which I've never done, but if you read a Wikipedia page about Finance 101, which I have done, you know it's mostly about risk and reward, right? So you want to find the bundle of portfolios that has the best long-term expected return while minimizes the variance in that. Okay? And we can adopt that same principle in terms of thinking about the ecological risk and the expected economic reward. So we can look at, in this case, we're going to look at the risk being the probability of missing your management target in terms of not collapsing a stock, and then look at the expected net present value as the benefit part. So, for instance, then you could take a look at these different decisions that you might make in terms of what you think is going on, in terms of the expected benefit, and then the risk, and you can plot those out. And in this case, basically, this was an easy one. This is all you cared about because the yellow dot, which is the tipping point assumption, would have the highest economic benefit and the highest risk. That would be by far the winner. Okay? But this is just for one sector. So now we can look at these risk and benefit plots for all the different sectors. And when both species are abundant, it turns out decision-making also is not very hard. So each one of these dots, again, is another assumption, or basically another harvest strategy you might make. Everything is kind of bundled up here on the piscivore. It doesn't really matter what choice you get. Your risk is fine. And you get like a plus or minus 20% fluctuation here. And then over here on the prey, it looks like they're going to be pretty happy with most of them. They don't like the purple one very much because that's having a little bit of risk. But the others all look pretty good. So chances are on this one, you could probably grab the green one. That would probably be happy to both groups. Because the piscivore, they're just losing a little bit of expected benefit, but not incurring any risk. Then meanwhile, the prey fisheries, they're incurring just a teeny tiny bit of risk and not much loss of revenue. That seems like a reasonable compromise. So that looks easy enough. But then you get these other, this would be a classic sort of wicked problem here. If the initial condition is the predator are very, very scarce, you look at the risk-reward diagram for the piscivore, there's really only one choice. And that's basically, you want to assume that there's depensation, because basically if you assume there's not depensation, you're going to basically make a lot of bad choices. So that sector is only going to want you to follow this particular policy, but meanwhile, guess which one performs the worst on the prey side? It's this one. So now you've got a real big conflict between this particular group that only has one viable alternative versus over here, that's the worst of the alternative for that sector. That's a hard place to make management decisions. So how does this all come back to simplicity? Well, to summarize, if you just think about the world as states of nature and really simplify it in terms of things could be abundant or scarce, if everything is abundant, everyone's going to make money. If everything's scarce, people are going to make less money. but most of the action isn't in the aggregate economic performance. Instead, it's about the allocation of risk. And namely, if you're in that square or even that square, there's some risk in terms of sort of ecological risk, but not a lot. But you're in here, there's enormous risk. And what I mean by that is the cost of not knowing and that not knowing what's really going on is really, really high if you're in this particular state of nature. This is a terrible place to be. And at the same time, this is where all the conflict happens. Because the best choice for one fishery is the worst choice for the other, and vice versa. That's a very, very hard place to make decisions. So how does this factor into actually having reasonable decision making? Well, I don't know what is the right set of management decisions to make, but I know that I don't want to be in that square. So a reasonable systems-informed management strategy can say, hey, we're going to follow a bunch of management rules, but the biggest objective is to make sure we never land in this square, right? We want to make sure we always have cod, are never hugely scarce, and if they are scarce, we don't want to do it when hiring are super abundant. Now let's set up a management strategy that's designed to keep us out of that zone. Because if we're not in that zone, it turns out we don't need to know all those ecological scenarios. It's only when we're in this bit where the ecological uncertainty really rears its ugly head. So that's what I mean about sort of having ecological complexity and really deeply looking at it, and then coming out the other end with fairly simple management prescriptions. And if you think about that, that's very different from what we normally say as ecologists, and at least as me, is saying like, oh, you need a very, very complex management system that can keep track of how many eggs are being eaten by a cod right now, so you can have a feedback loop in case the egg predation gets too high, then you can induce that rule. But basically, you're always going to be operating under huge uncertainty. So instead, why don't you just figure out where's the biggest risk for not knowing the ecological system, and then stay out of that place. Deep breath. Okay, so that's the first part of my story, is sort of dealing with complexity. In this case, the complexity was the nature of the species interaction. Super complicated. There's all different ways they're connected. I'm going to totally abandon all of that right now, and then I'm going to pay attention to the part that I didn't talk about in the first part, which is small pelagic fish don't tend to be very stable populations. They tend to fluctuate like mad. In fact, here are some sparklines of a handful of different types of species. Pilchard is another name for a sardine. You can see they go many years with nothing, and then they spike up really high, and they come back down. And then chub mackerel, hugely abundant. They crash. They crash for like 30, 40 years. Then they explode again. They're around for like 10, 15 years, and they crash again. This is the anchoveta I talked a little bit about. They have a little bit different cycle where they're going up, then down, then up and down. Seems to be shorter frequency. All the way to Atlantic menhaden. These are really important, like in the Chesapeake Bay. They tend to be just more squiggly one year to the next. They don't seem to have this sort of low frequency thing. So these are not stable. So another degree of complexity is how do you sort of think about making management decisions that are trying to protect the ecological role when the inherent productivity of these things seems to be going up and down at the same time. So it's sort of adding another layer of difficulty to the question. So my students and I actually took this project on. We sort of did it as sort of a lab project, and we immediately realized it was really, really hard to look at all different parts of the population cycles. And we quickly sort of realized, well, gosh, there's really only one part of the population cycle that's probably most critical, and that's the downswings of the population cycle. And our reason for that was actually thinking about the abundant literature that's people have looked at how sort of the functional response or the population responses to predators in terms of prey abundance. So if you look at something like penguins, this is also just my shameless attempt to have penguin chick pictures in a presentation, which is always a good idea. And the science basically says that if you sort of look at this axis is saying what is your abundance of forage fish, going from less abundant to more abundant. What is the associated response in terms of reproductive success? And pretty much when things are abundant, there's really no signal, right? And this is sort of like the Thanksgiving dinner effect. So you go to Thanksgiving dinner, and Aunt Mary brought her casserole, and Uncle Ted brought a big turkey, and then you made something else, and there's tons of food everywhere, and then somebody knocks over one dish. Like, do you really care? Like, you're going to live, right? You've got plenty of food. And that's basically what's happening with the seabirds. If there's plenty of food out there, fluctuations here and there, you don't see that manifest in sort of a population response. But when it's only when things become scarce, that's where you start seeing a signal. So if you think about layering that on top of these population cycles I'm talking about, it's probably the troughs of those population cycles is where all the action is in terms of sort of the ecological role. If those troughs get really, really deep, much deeper than they would get naturally, that might have a much bigger effect on predators than worrying about the average total abundance or the peak of these cycles. So we're going to focus on those troughs of the population cycles, and to try to get at a question that's been going on forever, which is sort of this long-standing debate about what's more important, fishing or the environment. And frankly, I'm so tired of this argument. This probably happens in a lot of different fields. Everybody wants to point the finger at somebody else. The big point that I'm going to make today, this is not an either-or. It's about the interaction between the two. So you can have fishing and environmental swings, and it's all about having a management system that can be responsive to the environmental change. And when you don't have that, that's where you have some of the big problems. So how do we do that? So we want to know about whether or not fishing has a detectable fingerprint on the population cycles, particularly looking at the troughs of those cycles. So how do we do that? First, I looked at stocks from around the world. Definitely a bias towards the northern hemisphere because that's where we had the most data. This is using a database that other people have compiled, and they were very nice to share it. And basically, the stocks that we have add up to about 2/3 of the global catch. So basically, we're not looking at the weirdo stocks. We're looking at a lot of the big stocks that are out there. And then we did sort of the following experiment. What we did is we took each of those stocks, has a little squiggly line of population biomass. Because we have population biomass, we could translate that into an annual population growth rate because we have the change in population size from one year to the next. So now I get a time series of population growth rates, and I can characterize those population growth rates in terms of two things: the overall amount of variability, and then what is the time scale of that variation. So some of those stocks you saw had really long, sort of 30-year cycles, where others are sort of annual cycles. And that gives me a way to sort of describe the world in terms of the overall variability and the frequency. And then from that, I can sort of statistically describe that world. I can take random draws from that world that I've just created. From the random draws, create new simulated growth rates that are faithful to the same amount of variability and the timescales of variability. And then after I simulate the population growth rates, I can simulate population biomass trajectories. And then what I ask is whether or not my simulated biomass at the end match the actual biomass. So in other words, do the actual troughs of population cycles, are they as low as we would expect given the inherent population biology characteristics? And as you might expect, the answer is no. So what you can do is, for all these stocks, you can say, hey, what was the lowest population size it got relative to its average? So on this graph here, 0.2 would mean one particular stock reached 20% of its average biomass before it kicked back up. So basically, how low is the lowest trough? And the data are plotted as a cumulative probability. And if you prefer histograms, just go ahead and look at the top. Just showing a histogram of what is the floor of the population cycle expressed as a fraction of the average. And then the orange swath there that's the range you would expect based on the inherent productivity characteristics. And the key thing about it is we get way, way more stocks that are reaching really, really low population levels than you would expect just based on the natural productivity, which is suggesting that's the role of fishing on these things. So this is looking at the natural productivity and saying, what's the additional effect of fishing? And it seems to be causing those things to dip a lot lower. Well, why is that happening? Well, we can take a little bit closer look at some of the stocks that collapse. This is a nice spaghetti diagram. I just like looking at it because it's pretty colors. But the main thing I want you to see is on the left-hand side, which is the years before the stock collapse happens, you get a lot of red lines, which correspond to very, very high fishing intensity. So for instance, 0.8 means you're catching 80% of the biomass every year. That's a lot. And you see that before the collapse. After the collapse, mostly the colors revert back to blue, which is good. That means the fishery management is being responsive, but it seems like it's a little bit too late. We could dig in a little bit closer and actually do that same type of thing and look at a sort of years since collapse and ask, well, what was the overall productivity on average of those stocks that collapsed, and what was the overall fishing rate? And that looks like this. So the blue are the intrinsic population productivity. So in this case, on average, sort of trucking around, and on average, the natural productivity reaches a low point about a year or two before the population hits its lowest bit. Now, a perfectly adaptive management regime would be perfectly titrating the fishing rate to match that productivity slide. So we would want to see those red lines tracking the blue lines. But what's happening instead is when this thing, the population is tanking, the fishing rate's actually going up. So exactly the time that you would want to be hitting the brakes, they're missing and hitting the throttle instead. And that's basically the mechanism that's causing fishing to amplify those troughs. And again, that's probably the period which so another way to view this, when I talk about the population troughs, we talk about the Thanksgiving. Think of like day 7 of a 10-day backtracking trip. Imagine that. Imagine like your friend eats the last granola bar. How mad are you, right? That's what the seabirds feel about us, right? Things are scarce, and then someone took their very last thing of food. And that's basically what we're doing. And the reason why is largely because we probably are slow to detect that population collapse. It's not that we're just being meanies. It's just that we're probably setting a fishing level that we think is great. Then after the fact, we realize, oops, that was too high. Let's skip over that. So how does this feed into the story about ecological complexity and management simplicity? Well, the complexity I'm talking about is the fact that the true population productivity is going up and down. And while it would be awesome if we could get real-time estimates, like put a probe in the water, what's the sardinometer this year? Oh, it's a 12. Great. Now do harvest policy that matches with number 12, whatever that means. We're probably never going to have that. We're probably only going to really understand the productivity in hindsight. We're never going to get that perfect thing. So what's our simple management solution? Well, I'm just going to talk about one frankly kind of lame way that we looked at it. We've since looked at it more sophisticated ways, and the same sort of rules have come out. Basically said, well, what if you just had a really, really simple harvest rule that looked like this? Namely, whenever the biomass is fluctuating around, and whenever you think it's dropped around to less than half of its long-term average, you say, sorry, everyone, no fishing right now until the population bounces back. All the other times, you fish as you have done historically. So no change, everything's exactly the same. That's the only thing we said. Follow what you did historically, except for those periods when the population is low. Then we could say, hey, what would have happened to the ecosystem and what would have happened to the economies of those particular fisheries? Well, the answer is huge economic benefits. So those troughs now increase up 80%. So instead of bottoming off at 20%, they're bottoming up at like 40%. So much, much better. You say, hey, what percentage of those stocks would have collapsed? 65% fewer would have collapsed compared to what actually collapsed if they had followed that simple rule. Then you might be saying, yeah, but you lost all those catch during those low years. So you say, well, just average all the catch. Well, you would only lose 2% of the overall long-term catch if you did that. And if that seems like totally weird to you, it's largely because there's not much catch going on in those lousy years anyways. So you're basically foregoing catch in those lousy catch years, which is probably not great if that's your industry, but the economic benefit is actually quite strong. Now, since then, we've done like more elaborate testing of very different harvest strategies, but basically comes up the same thing. If you have some sort of catch that allows you to recognize that I'm not always going to be perfect at detecting these collapses, you can get a lot of economic benefits with very little economic cost. And to me, that is sort of the perfect management simplicity. So to wrap this up, I just wanted to sort of clarify one issue related to what I've been talking about. And I've been talking a lot about looking at natural systems, acknowledging there's complexity, and finding simple management solutions. And one thing I just want to underscore is I don't think that you can arrive at elegant and effective management solutions without first digging into this. Like, you have to explore the ecological complexity, which basically means I can keep my job. I can keep doing the things I like to do. But at the end of the day, it's really on to me to come up with a meaningful and doable practical set of solutions that I think are robust to the things that I think are predictable and things that are not. So when I say it's going from ecological complexity to managed simplicity, I do not mean ignoring the complexity, but rather embracing and exploring the complexity and then using that to drive elegant and simplistic management solutions that people can actually follow. So as I mentioned, a series of papers I mentioned, I'll just keep this up here during the Q&A in case people want to jot those things down. But with that, I'll be happy to take some questions. Yeah, Fader.
You said that the reason that the fishing probably continues to increase as the stocks are starting to crash is because we haven't detected it fast enough.
Yeah.
Isn't that also a human behavior response when the stock starts to decline?
Yeah. So the question was, if everyone couldn't hear, to what extent is the fact that when the population productivity is going down, the fishing rate is sort of going up? How much of that is due to slow detection versus sort of a grab them while you can sort of mentality, which actually the economic models say you should do, is just go crazy for a while. When we actually take a look at the catch rates actually are being ratcheted down. They're just not coming down fast enough. So, and it sort of depends on the particular management regime. So I'm not in the room to know, hey, what was the pressure on the management decision versus what was the scientific advice. My experience has been from looking at other stocks that even weren't forage fish, it's usually been more of a retrospective oops type of thing, as opposed to, particularly like in the US where there are pretty strict laws about how the stock has to be assessed and how you have to follow rules. The same type of thing happens. And that's pretty much what happened in New England cod, except for all of the theft that happened. But was the stock collapsed due to environmental conditions, but they were so slow to detect it, they just were hammering it for about 5-10 years. So there's probably a little bit of both, but I think a lot of it's just slow to detect. Go in the back there, then Jeremy.
So I have a comment on the last question.
Yeah.
The comment is that continuing on these market force drivers, as catch goes down,
Mm-hmm.
prices
Yeah.
go up.
Mm-hmm.
If prices go up, that means that you have more fish spending more time, more effort there getting those fish back.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there were a couple of papers showing that actually drives collapse pretty strongly, that lingering effect of prices going up and up.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for stocks where. So the question was, as things become scarce, the price is going to come up, and that's going to be an incentive to keep fishing more. For stocks that have a limited geographic range of the market, it's definitely true. These are all kind of global commodities. So usually what tends to happen if one of the stocks collapses, they start sourcing from another place, and that tends to make the price much more stable. In this case, it's hard to actually see a signal of stock collapses. The signal is largely from what's happening in aquaculture. That's where you can really see the price effect.
My question was more about how do you apply your simple solution, your second simple solution, when it means that you're taking some people off the business for a year or
Yeah.
10 years that they can't make money.
Yeah, absolutely right. So that was a very simple sort of proof of concept. We used that then to justify sort of a deeper study that would look at more sort of things that were a little bit more doable in terms of these harvest rules. And we looked at a wider range of sort of performance measures that were a mix of ecological and industry. And we engaged the industry to tell us, hey, what's important to you? So they said, stability is actually more important than the average amount of catch. People have also told me that everyone says that until you suggest lowering their catch, and they go like, no, I'll take instability. But also, like, they want the closure is very, very hard. Particularly, it's unpredictable. So if a closure happens, but it's predictable with enough lead time, that's more palatable. They don't like it. But they all understand that might probably has to happen. It's sort of the nature of fishing a stock that does these up and downs, particularly like sardines is, for instance. And we basically found a very similar thing is different types of species, the best rule really varied depending on the life history of the fish. You couldn't do perfect across the board, but there were some pretty good compromises that you could get at. But I completely agree. Like a lot of people just saying, good news, you don't get to fish for the next 5 years, they wouldn't view that as being great. Yeah, I think Jeremy, you had a hand up?
So technology over the last several hundred years has improved, which changes also has changed the way that we are able to monitor.
Yeah.
And that's probably going to continue to change into the future. So do you think that makes, if you try to balance our ability to forecast and have more real-time data versus fishermen being more effective, what do you think the future of a lot of these fisheries, how is that going to play out?
Yeah. So Jeremy's sort of asking about can we get better at forecasting some of these population cycles with the advent of new tools and new technology? My guess is going to depend a lot on the individual stock. So you take an offshore, widely dispersed species. That's always going to have a lot of challenge. There's a lot of spatial structure. The gears that we use to sample them often don't give us a good index of abundance. All they do is to give us a composition. So they're always going to be kind of hard. Other things that are more coastal and longer lived, like herring, you can actually do probably a good job of keeping a really good track of what's the recruitment, where are they growing in, how all that is happening. And anchovy are the hardest ones because they're like weeds. So they're here and they're gone. So by the time you know how much were here, they're already dead, and you're already a little bit too late. And like anchoveta, they've spent millions to monitor that, and they're still kind of guessing a lot. So some of the inherent population biology, I think it's always going to be challenging. Will we get better indicators? Probably. I'll go, Hugh.
So how would the presence of marine reserves affect all this, where you have spots in the ocean which are no fishing,
Yeah.
and then you have the exploitation all around them?
Yeah, so the question is, well, what's the role of sort of spatial management and reserves as another simple management tool to deal with that? And I think that's a perfect example of a simple management tool that can be used to buffer against ecological uncertainty. We didn't explore it in this particular scenario just because these are such widely ranged things. They aren't really practical for this type of species, but for other species, it might make total sense that rather than have these rules where you are maybe ratcheting back fishing for a little bit further, you're relying on the buffer you're getting from the closed area. And the way you would address that was by doing the same thing I did. It's like, let's explore the key uncertainties here. What are the pinch points where the uncertainty becomes really, really costly, and what solutions seem to work really well for that? And it may be a marine reserve. Yeah, Wayne. Yeah.
How well has your advice been accepted, given you're just an ecologist?
Yeah, so Wayne is asking who wants to listen to me as an ecologist, and it sort of depends on who you ask and how much those people are listening. So, for instance, the detailed paper that I didn't show, which was really digging into the weeds of doing a formal evaluation of management strategies, that's been very, very well received. This sort of thought experiment, I don't think anyone should take those advice. In fact, I even said really clearly in the paper, this is not a recommendation at all. But I think the bigger idea that I think people are happy with is this idea that let's try to find the safe zones and try to have management to keep us in that safe zones. That's actually really appealing to decision makers, and that's been really, really widely accepted. Yeah.
So this whole practice of going from ecological complexity to simple management strategies is really great. And the case with the cod and the herring, even though there's that hidden complexity with herring eating the cod eggs, it's still a relatively simple ecological system, right? So I'm thinking of cases where there's hundreds of interactions in a more complex system. Do you still think that we can make some kind of management recommendations, some heuristics, understanding the full complexity in systems that we can begin to forecast?
Yeah, great. So the question was sort of calling me out if I explored ecological complexity in a pretty simple example. So what about scenarios where there's many, many species interaction and maybe many, many fishery sectors will the same thing work? Frankly, I have no idea. But as a framework to start, so I guess there's two options or three. One is you could just say, well, I'm going to ignore all systemic linkages and hope for the best, and that's basically what we've been doing for a long time. Two, let's say we'll wait for the science to come in, which is basically a way to keep the status quo going, or try to do something in the middle ground, which is basically what I'm suggesting, is at least try to find solutions that are robust to the key uncertainties. And you may find doing this type of analysis here, there may be just a couple uncertainties that really drive the performance of different alternatives. And then try that, or at least consider it. I guess would be the way I view it. Yeah, thanks. I think you had a question there.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what I'm saying. So if you care about, so I'm a consumer, I care about carbon emissions.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard that it's better to eat small fish.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
where hopefully components in a value chain, each thing will have a carbon tax associated with it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think like through this. If we increase consumption of the small fish
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully reduce consumption of the pigs and
Yeah,
chickens and
right.
other
Mm-hmm.
fish, like would increasing demand for these small fish be sustainable?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question was about thinking more about sort of global carbon. The nice thing about fishing these small pelagic fish is they have the lowest carbon footprint of all the different fisheries. It's not very expensive to catch them. And then, so thinking long term, if we were trying to deal with carbon in food production systems that would seem to drive us towards this, is that actually sustainable given their ecological role? That's a super great question, and there have been people that have said, hey, one of the solutions, we should push for more direct consumption instead of fish feed. And I've never seen anyone actually give an answer of whether that would necessarily be good in the long run. I don't know. Like on one hand, it makes it pricier, and that would seem to increase the incentive to keep fishing more. Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I that's a fascinating question, and I do not know the answer. And I thought about it a lot. I don't know the answer.
Which is the tastiest?
Oh, wow. Gosh, it depends on the prepper. I mean, a grilled sardine is really, really good. But then, like, the Swedish matjes herring is also really, really good. So those would be my two contenders. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you have to understand something about the complexity to make these
Yeah.
sustainable management decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Have you guys looked at how much of the complexity do you have to know?
Oh, wow.
And kind of on top of that, is it more important to know the kind of strong interactions?
Yeah.
Or do you also have to have those weak interactions in there as well?
Wow. So the question is, how much complexity do you have to root into to find these robust management things? I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question. I think we should just be humble going into these questions, knowing that even if we did a full stakeholder scoping workshop, coming up with key uncertainties, we're not necessarily going to land on all of the important ones. And have that humility going into it, and not think that we've perfectly engineered this sort of thought process. And then whether or not to focus on the strong or the bundle of weak things, I think those should all be on the table initially, and then only remove things when you think you have a reason to remove them. But I don't think we're ever going to know the answer to that. It's a really, really good question.